The weather's about to get very crazy in the United States as we are going to be dealing with three completely different types of weather across the country, one of which will include severe weather like damaging winds, large hail, and tornadoes, which is not really new at this point as we've been dealing with that for several months. One thing that's going to be completely new to us and that'll reoccur a lot over the summer will be heat waves, and we have a big heat wave coming over the next 7 days. In addition to this, we have two different tropical systems that could develop before the end of June in the Gulf of Mexico. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down all three of these in detail for you and give you an idea of what will be happening in terms of the weather across the United States for the next 7 to 10 days. So let's begin with a broad overview of what will be happening across the country, beginning with the next few days. We are going to be talking about a large-scale high-pressure system on the eastern tier of the country. This is going to keep a lot of areas drier and warmer than average across a large chunk of the East Coast. So if you're back over in New England, the Mid-Atlantic region, or the Southeast, you can expect much drier weather and as well as much warmer weather overall, as that'll surge this heat wave across the eastern tier of the country. Meanwhile, we'll be continuing to watch for a very active weather pattern across the Midwest and the central and northern plains, where multiple rounds of severe weather will continue for the next several days. This will begin today and run really all the way through the rest of this week. Notice another large-scale low-pressure system will enter the country as we go into Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. This will bring more rounds of severe weather to the Midwest and as well as the central and northern plains, where I cannot rule out an isolated severe weather outbreak on one of these days, probably going to be either Monday or Tuesday of this upcoming week. And then once we go into Thursday into Friday, the same old pattern will continue. Dominant high pressure system on the East Coast, limiting a lot of the rain that'll happen on the eastern tier. In addition to that, we'll be talking about that heat wave. And then back over in the Gulf of Mexico is where we'll have to watch for a couple of different tropical systems that could develop before June is over. The first of which will happen during the middle of this week, impacting areas like Texas and maybe Louisiana, and as well as Mexico for sure. And then maybe another one by the tail end of this month, and we'll talk more about details on that here in just a moment. And before we go any further into this forecast, I just want to say happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, and I hope all of you have an amazing and fantastic day. Hopefully the weather is nice wherever you might be in the United States today. Unfortunately, though, the severe weather threat is not looking great for those over in the Midwest and as well as the central and northern plains, where there will be a potential for severe weather that could hinder some of those Father's Day plans for today. We even have a marginal threat that goes all the way back over into West Texas, so this is a pretty large area today for severe weather. The good news is that the severe weather risk is not super high. We're talking about a 2 out of 5 severe weather risk with mostly a damaging wind and large hail threat. So some cheese curd sized hail will be possible from Wisconsin back into Nebraska and South Dakota. On the flip side of things, the damaging wind risk is very low today, but it's not zero, so some flying trampolines are possible, but it's still a low risk overall. There will be a chance for an isolated tornado or two as well back over in parts of the upper Midwest, northern Iowa, back into Wisconsin, and southeastern Minnesota, all included in this very low-end threat for a isolated tornado or two. I think the risk, though, is going to stay very low today. It's going to be contingent on there being any sort of discrete supercells today. Once we go into tomorrow, severe weather will continue across the northern tier of the country, which is very typical for June. We'll be watching for another level 2 out of 5 severe weather risk from Nebraska back into Minnesota, where more damaging winds, hail will be possible, and maybe an isolated tornado. Marginal threat goes all the way back into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles as well, where more large hail and damaging winds will be possible. Tornado risk for tomorrow, it's another very low-end risk, but that'll include parts of South Dakota, southwestern Minnesota, and as well as parts of northern Nebraska. Let's talk about the timing for the severe weather today, beginning with the northern plains. Overall, storms will be pretty isolated throughout the morning and afternoon, primarily across northern Minnesota. That activity ramps up as we go into the afternoon, with a couple of discrete supercells being possible in eastern Minnesota, and anything that can remain discrete could produce the potential for very large hail and maybe an isolated tornado. So just keep that in mind if you're either in Minnesota or even back over into northern Wisconsin. Late tonight, we are eventually going to get some storms firing off in South Dakota. These will quickly move to the east, and really any storm that forms in this environment tonight will be predominantly going to be a wind and hail threat. So overall, not super concerned about this. It's also going to be pretty disorganized, but as it moves to the east, damaging winds and hail will be the main concern for Minnesota, South Dakota, and eventually Wisconsin by the early morning hours of Monday. Eventually, as we go closer to lunchtime on Monday, storms are clearing out of most of Minnesota and South Dakota, but guess what? We're we're not done with storms because we're gonna have another round of storms going into Monday late afternoon into the evening hours, and we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Back over in the Midwest, notice that we do have some tornado parameter values between 1 and 2 across parts of very far northern Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota, where we could see an isolated tornado. So keep that in mind if you're back over in those areas. Again, it's a relatively low threat, but anything that can stay discreet could produce a tornado. Here's the timing for today. Storms will on go this morning with mostly just some gusty winds and small hail. By this afternoon, we'll watch for a couple of storms to fire up in Minnesota. Anything that can survive into Wisconsin, again, could produce an isolated tornado, but again, it's a really low risk overall today. By the overnight hours, we're done with storms, at least until late overnight into early Monday morning, and that'll be primarily for northern Wisconsin, where more damaging winds will be a possibility. And then as we go into really late Monday, we'll have another pop-up area of thunderstorms across parts of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, but overall, nothing really too crazy out of this is expected. Just mostly outflow-driven storms, if anything gets going there, with some isolated sporadic hail and wind. And then once we go into late Monday afternoon, storms will initiate across a large area of Nebraska and even South Dakota back into Minnesota. Any storms that get going here will be mostly wind and hail producers, but an isolated tornado can't be ruled out in a very narrow corridor from parts of South Dakota and Nebraska back into Minnesota. These storms will be mostly during the afternoon and evening, and eventually going into the overnight hours, things start to quiet down just a little bit, with some rumbles of thunder still being a possibility. The second thing that's in our menu for today in terms of weather is going to be the overall heat wave that we're going to be seeing in the United States. The jet stream is going to be staying really far off to the north as we go into next week. This will allow for a very dominant upper level ridge to just sit across the eastern tier of the country, and this is very typical for this time of the year. We do see these a lot more often in June and July than what we would see like for in the winter, for example. So this is a very common trend that we'll have as we go throughout the summer months, so just get ready for this. But this ridge does not look like it's going to be moving much over the next couple of weeks. If it does move at all, it might move out here to the west, and if that happens, we're going to start to see a drier and calmer weather pattern across a large chunk of the southern tier of the country, and we already have that, but that will obviously solidify that overall unless we get some sort of tropical disturbance. The temperature anomalies for the next several days do indicate that above average temperatures will continue across the entire eastern tier of the country, including the Great Plains. Meanwhile, a surge of colder air will usher into the northwest, so some nicer weather there overall, but overall it's going to stay very warm and dry across most of the eastern tier of the country, and the Great Plains will kind of be a battle zone where we'll still be dealing with at least some showers and thunderstorms, in addition to the heat wave potential being there. Temperatures for the next few days are going to be really warm for this time of the year. This is tomorrow afternoon, and notice temperatures across much of the country in the 80s and 90s. Some areas in Canada will even be in the 80s. Notice this as we go into Tuesday, that temperature grind just continues to go up. Temperatures as high as near 100 degrees, possibly in eastern New York on Tuesday. By Wednesday, this heat wave does not show any relief. All of New England could be into the really high 90s, could even get close to 100 in some areas up there. And eventually by Thursday, it'll probably start to simmer down just a little bit. But even in the Ohio Valley, high temperatures well into the mid to upper 90s. So it's going to be very hot as we go throughout the week. So definitely get prepared for that sort of weather. Before we go into the tropics, I did want to show you guys that this storm is going to be literally shattering records. Many areas in the Ohio Valley, Midwest, and even back into the eastern tier of the country will be shattering records. High temperatures well above average and record-breaking territory from Chicago back into Rochester, New York for Monday. By Tuesday, that shifts to the northeast, and many areas in the northeast and as well as near Washington, D.C. will be challenging records. By Wednesday, that'll expand even further to the south, going as far south as areas like Tennessee. By Thursday, this will kind of sit in the same area, and then eventually by Friday into Saturday, many areas across the eastern tier of the country will continue to deal with the potential for record-breaking high temperatures. So this will definitely be shattering records across much of the eastern tier of the country. Now, the tropics are going to get interesting as we go throughout the rest of June. We do have a pretty high likelihood that we're going to see some sort of tropical disturbance trying to develop in the western Gulf of Mexico over the next 5 days. Now, overall, it's kind of a 50-50 chance right now, but I do think we're going to get some sort of tropical development here as we go into Tuesday or into Wednesday. Regardless of development, it's not going to probably become a hurricane. More than anything, it'll probably just dump a lot of rain across parts of Mexico and as well as Texas and maybe into parts of southern Louisiana. Carolina. But overall, wind not really looking much of a concern, and even storm surge really does not look like much of a concern right now as we go into next week. But something to watch for, especially if you're in Texas, as this system will likely impact areas like Texas, and it's going to be a very slow-moving system as it moves west into Mexico and or Texas. So those areas, just stay vigilant. Overall, a lot of rain is expected to come out of that. Now, once we get past that event, we will likely see some sort of tropical system develop as we go sometime into the later half of this upcoming week or into the following week as we go into the last week of June. But that remains very uncertain. The GFS model actually shows a little tropical system actually making landfall in Florida as we go into the tail end of this week. That remains a major question mark. And then even as we go into next week, things will really remain very uncertain. But there might be some sort of tropical disturbance again in the Gulf of Mexico as we go into the following week. So sometime around like June 20th to June 26th. But again, we're still very far out. Things could definitely change. So just make sure you're staying tuned to the channel, and we'll keep you posted with the latest as we get closer to this and as well as any other tropical systems in the United States.